So, hello, comrades. Welcome to our final session in this series, which has been fascinating, on revolution and counter-revolution between 1914 and 1939. We will be moving on to a new series, but we're going to have a little break in between. And we're also thinking about having a series on republicanism, which we're currently in discussion with organizing. So tonight we'll be joined by Kevin Bean, who's been doing much of the preparation for this series, by Matthew Jones, the LLA Education Officer, and hopefully we'll also be joined by Ed Bober, who delivered a fantastic session on China. It's very interesting. So today we're basically bringing this series to a close, and we want to look at what lessons, if any, we can learn from our series. What can we learn from this period between 1914 and 39? What lessons perhaps for today even, but also what was the key things we should have learned from this session, from this series going forward. So first it's going to be Kevin, then Matthew, and then Ed, hopefully if he joins us. And then we're going to open it up for discussions and questions from the floor. So Kevin first, thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Tina. Thanks, comrades. Tonight's session is really a sort of summing up of, or is an attempt to have a summing up discussion of all of the sessions, which I think began somewhere in late January, February. So it's when the snow was on the ground to when the sun is now high in the sky, almost moving towards autumn. In that time, we've covered really quite a lot of quite important events. And why, along with other comrades, I thought that we should look at this period is that in many ways, we still live in the shadow and with the effects of those events. When you think of the Russian Revolution, which is probably the major event of that period, both in the sense that it ushers in a new attempt at building socialism. It is a beacon of a socialist state. It is the world's first working class state. It shows the ability of the working class to take power, and it, as a model and as a beacon, as an inspiration, is going to be very influential, and it will be influential, really, I would suggest, up until the present time, for all sorts of movements, but also it will be very controversial in the sense that how that revolution develops. You know, Hillel, Tikhtin talked about Stalinism and the nature of that regime. It's also a very controversial subject, and where it went, whether it went wrong, its strengths and its weaknesses have been fairly hotly debated and still continue to be so. But it was also, I think, that revolution was a warning to the capitalist class, and indeed it terrified them. It terrified them both in and around 1917 and in the early 1920s, but it continued to terrify them into the 30s and the 40s, and of course in the post-war period into the Cold War. It framed world politics into a war between capitalist democracies, so-called, and what was defined as a socialist bloc. And so, in many ways, the framing of world politics throughout much of the 19th century occurs in the period that we've been considering. It's also a period, though, that doesn't only throw up revolutionary potential, both in Central Europe, in Asia, in, of course, the Spanish Revolution, and those revolutionary movements that I looked at last week when I was looking at the anti-imperialist movements, and of course the movements that Ed looked at when he talked about developments in China. But it also threw up counter-revolutionary movements, and those counter-revolutionary movements took various forms. In the immediate aftermath of the Russian Revolution and the German Revolution, those consisted of movements of the state, the established bourgeois state, or as in the case of Germany, a newly emerging state, a bourgeois state, but a state that relied upon German social democracy. So the leaders of German social democracy murdered and worked with the German general staff to kill their former party comrades, Luxemburg and Liebknecht, and in a sense to facilitate a counter-revolution. But counter-revolution also took another form in the form of fascism, both in Italy. We had a very good talk there from David Broder on the nature of fascism in Italy, but perhaps more dramatically, more horrifically, in the form of Nazism in Germany and the crushing of the German working class movement, the installation of a totalitarian dictatorship, and then ultimately the horrors of the Second Imperialist War, and of course the absolute barbarism of the extermination of the Jewish population of Europe, and of course the destruction of large areas of the European continent in that period. But also, I think what we attempted to look at was really how we might classify the period. And those are the last few comments I want to make here. The period just before 1914 was a period of some optimism and some strength in the working class movement. And indeed, when the imperialist war broke out in 1914, many people, Lenin included, didn't believe that the leaders of the working class actually had behaved in the way that they did in supporting their own ruling classes in taking part in that war. Lenin famously believed that the reports that the SPD's Reichstag deputies had voted for war credits, he thought that was a propaganda stunt by the imperial regime in Berlin. So this was a period of great strength of the working class movement, a great revival of it. But of course, it was also a period in which the debates were emerging about the direction of that movement. And those debates weren't just theoretical or abstract debates. In the war itself, the question of whether the working class could take power, whether it could not only end the war, but also whether the working class was now capable of taking power and developing socialism, that was also quite a central issue. And for me, I think if I'm trying to periodize, I'm trying to look at this whole period, trying to characterize it, I see it in a sense as what Hillel Tektin called in his talk a period of transition. And of course, historians are famous for talking about transitions. They're famous for arguing that we can see the origins of one period in another. And, as some of my colleagues are very fond of telling me, when I always say, well, of course, this has got a long historical period behind it, they say that I explain everything in that way. And of course, that's one way to do it. But I think the point about transition is the idea that we are now in the 20th century, and of course even more so in the 21st, in a period in which objectively, for Marxists certainly, the possibilities that the working class can become the ruling class, that the conditions that capitalism has developed, both through the development of the means of production, the social changes, and indeed the organizational form that the working class had in 1914 did put that very much on the order of the day. So it means that the ability of the working class to become a decisive actor and to actually achieve socialist revolution internationally now becomes not just a theory, but actually a real possibility. And the reaction to the Russian Revolution is, I think, an example of that. But of course, if we see that potential, if we see that possibility of the working class being able to take power, we then have to explain why that hasn't happened, but also why and how the ruling class has attempted to stop that. And of course, this is where the issue of fascism is so important, but also the role of the labor movement and indeed of socialist and communist parties. That subjective factor, that factor which socialists from the time of Marx onwards have emphasized, is the decisive factor, that the working class needs to be developed as a coherent hegemonic force in society. It needs to shape itself. It needs to take control of the means of production. It needs, in a sense, to have a conscious strategy. And of course, the bourgeoisie is aware of that. Historically, again, we've seen that in these instances. And in the really vile counter-revolution that we looked at in the form of fascism and Nazism, to actually mobilize forces that will not only prevent that happening, but indeed to carry out really very barbarous counter-revolution, not just the arrests of a few leaders, not just the suppression of democratic rights, but actually an exterminatory program, the consequences of which we know. So that idea of the potential for transition and the objective conditions and the subjective factor of revolutionary movements is, I think, one of the key questions. Leon Trotsky, when he was writing in the late 1930s, talked about the death agony of capitalism, and he talked about the crisis, the revolutionary crisis, is in a sense reduced to revolutionary leadership. And of course, we've seen in our various discussions the failures of that revolutionary leadership. Matthew did a very good talk on Spain and looked at not just the failures of revolutionary leadership, but actually the counter-revolutionary forces within the workers' movement in the form of Stalinism. And of course, I've already referred to the German Socialist Party leaders who cooperated in that way. The last point I would make is that if we look for lessons, I think we have to look at both the relationship between the objective and the subjective, but we also have to be aware that the Second World War, leads to yet again a different historical period, the post-war world. And although we often talk of these continuities, I think that the existence of the Soviet Union and the great power shifts, particularly the decline of the British Empire in the post-war period, the post-First World War period, and of course that's going to be accelerated in the 1940s and 1950s into the 1960s, that will throw up again other revolutionary possibilities. So if we're looking at the wider history of the 20th century and on into the 21st century, many of the forms are established in this period, but the issue of transition that we've talked about, this possibility of socialism, I think is still very much strong. And although the subjective forces of revolutionaries and of socialists who want to achieve that are smaller, the possibilities, I think, are still there. And so those would be some of the points that I would like to discuss. And I suppose also to remind ourselves of the sort of ebbs and flows of this movement. Karl Radek in 1918 describes the workers of Moscow assembling when they hear the news of the German Revolution. And they say, relief is coming. We're no longer isolated. Our German comrades are coming to assist us. And this will be the beginnings of the World Socialist Revolution. And we know how that revolution was isolated. And we know the great defeats. And if we look at the end of the period, we can see the disappointments, indeed the betrayals, both of Stalinism and the hopes of that revolution, but also the great defeats. I mean, that's really too small a word to think of what happened under Nazism and the imperialist war. But it does remind us of the possibilities. And this is not a sort of morale boosting talk to say, well, cheer up. It might appear dark at the moment, but brighter days are coming. but it is to remind ourselves that history often does throw up many different forces and many different forms. And socialists in 1914 were very pessimistic about the imperialist war. And within 3 to 4 years after the slaughter of that war, they saw the Russian Revolution. Now, I think we have to retain, that optimism, but also to, be realistic as well. And I hope that these historical discussions will draw attention to that. They're not just defeats, they're also victories. And we need to think of that as a way in which we can learn lessons from the history of our movement. Anyway, that's my introduction. So I wind up now and hand over to Matthew.
Right. Thank you very much, Kevin. Some very important points there, not to look at them as defeats, but also as, victories that kind of, weren't outright victories, but have to be seen in the bigger scheme of things. I certainly agree with that. Okay. Ed Boba is not there yet, so if you want to talk a little bit longer than 10 minutes, you can do. And then we can bring Kevin back in as well. Thank you, Matthew.
Okay, all right. Thank you, comrades. Thank you, Kevin. Well, I think Kevin's raised a series of the questions that really exist within this period. I think, and continue to exist to this day. I mean, I think that really what you're looking at, obviously. And I think crucially, really, it is Trotsky who thinks in this long term and understands these huge the whole questions of capitalism and its evolution and particularly its decline. The fact that obviously there is a teleology, that there is a position in which a system comes into being, rises to maturity, and then declines. And he understands this to be the period of the decline of capitalism, which is why he exactly writes the whole question of his point of a transitional program. He said, well, we are in the period of transition between socialism and between capitalism and socialism, and that is exactly his, how he comes to it. And I think that's the overall arc of this. I think that if you're looking at the start of the period with the First World War, I mean, you have this system, which as Serge says, it's a sort of solid system. These sort of monarchies and these things that look, there's many cases been around for hundreds of years and look solid and all this sort of thing. And then of course there's this. Because of course, the conflict of the forces of production and the issue between the capitalist classes themselves, this enormous conflict, which I mean kills millions, destroys actually, I think has a huge effect in terms of people's understanding of the system. That suddenly the system, is actually, murdering their youth by millions. I think that's a huge thing. In what is clearly to anybody with any sense. I mean, and not nearly say. I mean, you can disguise parts of the Second World War by saying, well, they have to fight the fascists and all this sort of thing. Whereas, of course, obviously there is an inter-imperialist conflict underneath that. But I mean, the First War is naked. I mean, it's naked slaughter. And people clearly, by the end, understand this, that the system itself is awful. And the thing is that also, I think the other thing, of course, is the key question, which I think Kevin raises, is the question of cadre and of the revolutionary nature, not just of the working class, but actually of a revolutionaries, that people dedicate themselves to understanding the need for revolution and methodologies of revolution, the nature of the society, and the means of actually changing it. And this is critical. As I think it said one talked to previously in terms of the important thing becomes this subjective question of how does the working class, as the gravedigger of the system, actually understand its own historical role? To what depth does it understand that, and to what basis does it move to the point of saying, well, it is our job to remove this system and institute something else? And it's precisely that you know, we see, you know, you can see played out in Russia, because it's really critical that you see that you have, you know, as in contrast to 1914, in which this cadre of people, you know, who've prepared themselves over a whole series of you know, the Second International, of course, goes back over decades, and there was this serious debate, and particularly, obviously, you know, Luxembourg and so on, warnings of the war. I mean, more serious debate of the coming war than anywhere else. And an effort to say, well, we will resist it. And the problem is the whole thing then collapses, with the exception of really, you know, obviously a small number of people, as you know, pointed out. You know, if you look at the Kienthal conference, you know, where they have the conference, the anti-war left in Switzerland, in which people say, well, you know, we can encompass the whole of the anti-war left in Europe in one railway carriage. You know. Obviously not quite true, but you know, a depressing moment. You know, from the point of view having, you know, major congresses in London, Berlin, and so on, holding a meeting in this horrible, you know, apocalypse. You know, in which the participants are in one railway carriage. But in Russia, then we have a cadre of people who have been through a revolution, or a form of revolution in 1905, and then are capable of carrying out the full thing in 1917, which is why, I mean, 1917 is still, I mean, I think we have to understand it is still the most important event in human history. You cannot move it from that until somebody goes, or some group go beyond that. The thing is that it's that cadre that's critical. Of people who have that experience, and then can carry it through, and okay against the weak point and the rest of it. But if you look in that in contrast to what happens in Germany, precisely that you don't have that, and you have a you know, a much smaller cadre and a lesser degree of understanding, and clearly a lesser degree of tactical and strategic thinking. I mean, even on the part of Luxembourg and Liebknecht, you know, I mean, if you look at the history of how, you know, Lenin and Trotsky and others proceed in Russia, I mean, they go through all of this stuff, you know, and they're really very, very, attention to detail is extreme, and they look at, you know, how they can tactically take advantage of this and that and the rest of it, and preserve themselves and preserve their own organizations so they're not slaughtered and all this sort of thing. And none of that happens in Germany. So it's critical. And you see the mess. I mean, you can go through the whole stuff of the mess of what happened post First World War in Germany, which is critical, as Kevin points out. And I think that the other thing, of course, is the other point. The other 2 points, I think, which are important are, first of all, obviously what evolves out of Russia is Stalinism, and Stalinism actually blocks the development of revolutionary movements for a period of decades. I mean, you know, and not just sort of casually by killing people. I mean, they actually, you know, the point is that, I mean, in the center of this period, we have the Moscow trials and the imprisonment and slaughter of that revolutionary generation of 1917, which is one of the worst crimes of being committed by any group anywhere, you know, for that against humanity, and that's central. And so that proceeds through, you know. And you can see it in Germany, you can see it in Spain, you can see it in China with the massacres in Canton, and the ridiculous maneuvers of the Chinese Communist Party under the instructions of Stalin and so on. You know, the loss of millions. And that is without Stalin, no Hitler. There's no question that fascism, you know, in those terms, was certainly not in Germany, was not possible without Stalin, the actions of the Stalinists. So that's a critical point. The second, I think the other point, I think also that's important and that we need to take recognition of is also the development of the working class and the issue of the, you know, the working class itself continues to fight and continues to you know, I mean, as we'd expect, combativity towards the capitalists, and that increases through the period, as it were. You know, and you get, you know, the development of a new set of you know, organisations, even down to you know, the CIO in the US, which I think is, you know, obviously an incredibly important development, you know, in those terms, and could have, you know, with decent revolutionary leadership could have gone a lot further, you know, in the conditions of, you know, the fact that the US obviously was the rising imperial power, and the, you know, at the same time, and clearly you have in the Great Depression an overwhelming crisis. Again, I mean, a restatement almost, you know, following on the First World War and the, you know, the clear sort of naked massacre. You then have a position, you know, with the Depression, in which again capitalism is exposed naked to the world as being a system which is clearly failing and clearly cannot provide for humanity, and in fact is run by a bunch of parasites, you know. And murderous parasites at that, you know. So it's again it's that exposure and the response to that, but again the stifling effect of Stalinism, the fact that it's capable of crushing, you know, a revolutionary movement. I mean, I think also, I mean, I think that the other thing is that we should point out, of course, in not only, of course, the key of the, you know, the failure of the German Revolution, the failure of in Spain, the failure in China and in other places. I mean, even sort of going down to the massive, you know, class battles in the US and France. But then, of course, the stifling of post-Second World War revolutionary movements. I mean, again, capitalism, you know, conditions of extreme weakness on its part. Okay, you know, armed to the teeth, but with no great control of even its own armies. I mean, there are mutinies all over the place. You know, and under conditions in which huge millions of workers are armed. You know. Again, it's the solidification of re-solidification of capitalism in the 40s and early 50s is entirely due, in my view, to the actions of the Stalinists. And without that, then it would have opened the door. You know, as Serge says, you know, actually, his view, he was stuck in an appalling French prison in which he nearly died in the First World War. And his, of course, his thing was, of course, he understood, you know, as a I mean, emigre, his family obviously Russian, as an emigre family, he understood. So, well, you know, this is it. You know, this is an awful position, but we understand, you know, that the one thing that's going to happen is the Russian Revolution, because this regime cannot survive this. And the Russian Revolution opens the door to the future. Thanks, Conrad.
Thank you, Matthew. Okay, Ed Boba has not joined us, so we are just going to open up to the floor now. So if comrades want to make a contribution, raise the hand. I mean, Matthew and Kevin, feel free to, you know, come in during the discussion. There's enough time. Actually, I was going to ask Matthew a question. I mean, the interesting thing about this period is that it's all very much interlinked, isn't it? I mean, there's sort of without the Russian Revolution, you wouldn't have the Spanish Civil War and the uprising there, and without you know, the Cultural Revolution in China, etc. It's all going back to the Russian Revolution and that example. And the Russian Revolution wouldn't have been possible without the Germans making revolution or attempting to make revolution, and Lenin expecting that this revolution would be successful, because he knew that socialism in one country is impossible, and the Russians will be doomed without the German workers making revolution as well. But I was going to pick you up on one thing you said, you know, this without Stalin, there would have been no Hitler. And I think that's an interesting thing to say. Not quite sure I agree with it. Certainly without the Soviet Union, there wouldn't have been a Hitler or Nazism, because with, you know, Soviet Union served as quite a threat to capitalism in that period. And with capitalism in Germany being unable to solve the crisis of itself, of capitalism, it had to turn to something like fascism to solve its own crisis. There were constantly new governments, etc. The defeat of the First World War, etc., had led to an absolute crisis that it could not resolve itself. But why do you think there was something special about, you know, Stalin in that sense? How you know, that was, you know, how Stalinism was necessary to lead to Hitler? I think even just had the Soviet Union not degenerated as quickly under Stalin, I think we would still have had a similar situation in Germany, where, you know, the workers were unable to make revolution, but also capitalism was unable to rule and solve capitalism's crisis. So I'd be interested to hear a little bit more. What do you think was so special about Stalin in that period? Okay, Tony Greenstein first.
Yeah, I mean, really, it's just a few random thoughts put together in no particular order. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, I mean, I think it's quite clear that Stalinism was a consequence of the failure of the Russian Revolution, its isolation and defeat, in a sense. So I don't think we have to inquire too deeply into the character of Stalin. I mean, that would have occurred even if it hadn't involved the purges and so on. But I do agree that without Stalin, without Stalinism, there probably wouldn't have been Hitler. Stalinism, in adopting the third period and in equating, in essence, part of the working class with Hitler and the fascists, and their slogan after Hitler Us, disarmed and divided the working class in such a way that it was actually impotent and incapable of surmounting the challenge. I have no doubt of that. And if you like, the logical product of that was the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in 1939. And Stalin believed in it. He believed in it so much that he even returned German communists back into the tender mercies of Hitler. I mean, there is absolutely no doubt that Stalin believed that he could form an alliance with Hitler against the other capitalist powers. But what I want to say also about Matthew was, of course, Trotsky did believe that there was a forthcoming capitalist crisis after the war, and that the very existence of the system would be put into question. And he was wrong about that, because capitalism regenerated after the war and triumphed and massively expanded. And we see the product of that today with US imperialism. The question I ask is, how is it going to be possible to see a socialist revolution in the future? As a question I don't think any revolutionary group has seriously tackled, because what do we have in Britain? We have maybe revolutionary groups comprising 5,000 or so people at the most. We have a capitalist system which is busily destroying the planet, in essence. I mean, the crisis that we are seeing, and we've had a UN report only recently, that the world is entering a tipping point, in the sense, in terms of environmental disasters. And I think it's clear to me that capitalism is unable to deal and to solve that crisis, because capitalism by its very nature is short-termist, and it's based upon the blind accumulation of capital. It's unable, unlike a socialist society, to plan ahead. And without planning ahead, then you're going to, the world itself will go into, as I say, a possible terminal decline in terms of the survival of humanity itself. But what do we see? We see the major imperialist power gearing up almost. I mean, it's quite possible that we will see armed conflict in the near future with China. I mean, that's what the United States is doing with its pivot to Asia, which its pivot to China, which started under Obama and is gathering a pace. I mean, if you were to be on another planet, you would see how crazy it was watching the Earth from afar, that you have a crisis whereby a third of the world is hungry. You have incessant wars going on. And yet the United States is spending $750 billion a year plus on arms and weapons of war in order to actually stoke up and stir those conflicts. So I think we're in a real crisis. The question is, who is going to be able to challenge the existing centers of power in the capitalist West? And you talk about the working class being the gravedigger of capitalism. My only response to that is, I wish it were so. There is no indication whatsoever that the working class has achieved a consciousness in order to be able to overthrow or tackle or confront capitalism. We have the situation, I mean, in Britain itself, where the working class is riddled with chauvinism and patriotism, if you like, such that we saw the development of the Brexit phenomenon. And it's not just unique to Britain. That would be a mistake. We've seen the rise of the far right throughout Europe. And the working class today is more quiescent and more passive and more divided and more atomized than it's ever been at any time in its history. That is a real problem which socialists have to face up to. How do we get out of that impasse? I'm not offering any solutions except to say we do have to look wider afield. We do have to look at the revolutionary potential of social movements, such as, for example, Black Lives Matter, movements which can actually mobilize millions, but so far don't have an anti-capitalist agenda. And surely that is the role of socialists to provide it. As regards our strategy in Britain, I mean, many of us are involved in groups around the Labour Party, Labour in Exile and so on. I think we have to be quite clear that the Labour Party will never, contrary to the articles of faith of certain groups, the Labour Party, I don't think, will ever be one to socialism. It's an irredeemably reformist party. The question is how you can build a socialist movement either outside the party or which straddles the party and can take advantage of the gains in the past few years, which are being whittled away very quickly with the rise of Jeremy Corbyn. I don't pretend to have all the answers to that, but I think we first have to face up to the crisis we ourselves are in and to be quite realistic about what is happening and not simply exist on the diet of slogans, because they by themselves will not provide those answers. Thank you.
Thank you. Agnes, please.
Thank you. Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you and see you.
Oh, great. So Tina already made some comments, but I wanted to make it before Tina made it anyway. So I feel uncomfortable with Matthew's comparing Hitler and Stalin and saying that without Stalin there wouldn't have been any Hitler. So can I just say something practical? I was born during the Holocaust into Hitlerism, and then I was brought up in Hungary during Stalinism, and I can tell you there was a big difference. I mean, like in my case, the difference was life or death. And I mean, I could cite lots of examples what was possible during Stalinism, and it wasn't possible during Hitler's rule. But I'd just like to mention a little bit worried, because it's not, I'm not going to formulate it like a proper historian, but I mean, Hitler and his chums, they set out to murder, for instance, all the Jews, regardless. Stalin, yes, they had all these Zionist accusations and trials and all that, but they also allowed a lot of them to live, And I lived and I had an excellent education, because during Stalinism, which was during Rákos in Hungary, education and culture was wonderful. Anyway, I'm sorry, it's just that I don't feel that one should really compare Hitler and Stalin without giving proper consideration left, right, and center. And sorry, Matthew, I didn't mean to be critical. Thank you ever
Oh,
so much. Thank you.
like critical. That's really important to be critical. Okay, Kevin, do you want to reply to a few things then?
Yes, I'll begin with Agnes, and I'm not sure that Matthew can certainly speak for himself. I think the point that we're making is the relationship between Stalinist Russia and its strategy of defending the Soviet Union, and then the politics that evolved out of that. Agnes's personal experience, is valid, and obviously for many people, despite the repression of the Stalinist regimes, you could argue that there is a certain degree of historical progress associated there. I think the big debate is whether it is really the degree of progress. I have to say that the nature of Stalinism and indeed what it constitutes, whether, for example, it constituted a sort of defamation, and then the nature of that regime, I think, is still open to a lot of historical debate. But I certainly don't think of it as a socialist regime, and I see the regime that emerges as, in a sense, a sort of defamation, as something that represents the failures and the defeats of the revolution, for the reasons that Tina mentioned about the isolation of that revolution in a particular area. It's also clear that the political mistakes undertaken by communists in that period, particularly the Popular Front strategy of allying with the so-called progressive bourgeoisie, and indeed of restraining working class struggles. Matthew outlined that very well in terms of the situation in Spain. So I think that that is clearly an issue, and it's clearly an important issue. I think Tony raised some quite interesting points, which in many ways go beyond our period. And one of the things that struck me with the discussions that we had is that often what was primarily an historical discussion very quickly went over both into a later period, but also came up to the present day. And I think the sort of points that Tony raised is, which I think comrades are all aware of, I don't think anybody here, overestimates the difficulties that socialists have. And I don't think that we're downplaying those. But I think that we've got to look in some ways at the historical origins of those, and in particular, the problem that Stalinism as a form of politics, not just as a system that existed in Eastern Europe, but indeed its influence in other areas across the world. For example, in Western Europe, and I stress popular frontism. Above all, I stress the arguments that the working class must restrain itself, it must enter into alliances with progressive sections of the bourgeoisie, and that above all, it must sort of restrain and tailor its policies to those of the USSR when that system existed in that way. One other thing I would respond maybe to Matthew on is not only the use of fascism by the bourgeoisie, but it's also, I think, the other methods that the bourgeoisie use. And one of the points that I tried to put across in relation to fascism in Europe, and I think David Broder did this when he looked in particular at Italy, is this question of the social classes from which fascism draws its support, and in particular the conditions under which the ruling class will use fascism. And the point about the autonomy of those movements, the fact that they arise, as Trotsky describes it, from the petty bourgeoisie, his writings on that period are very informative because he's looking at them as a contemporary. But he's also, and indeed others are very well aware that the bourgeoisie will only use that agency, that form, when there's a real revolutionary crisis. So when Tony talks about the emergence of chauvinism and other forms, I think we have to be careful in not assuming that we're in a comparable crisis, say, to the 1930s. It was quite fashionable a few years ago, really across much of the liberal media, to say that we were reliving the 30s, so that Trump, for example, was defined as a fascist, and all sorts of movements on the right were defined in that way. If we see fascism as a mass movement of the petty bourgeoisie that's designed to destroy and smash the working class as an organized group, to atomize that class, and therefore to overthrow the threat of revolution, then we can very clearly see that we're not in that sort of period. And what often the capitalists will attempt to do is the situation that Daniel Lazare discussed in relation to the United States when he talked about FDR's New Deal. You know, that capitalism has a variety of methods and a variety of strategies. And I think that one of the lessons of the period that we've looked at is the various strategies available to the capitalists. We obviously need to focus on the way that our movement responds to capitalist crisis, but we also need to be aware of how the capitalists might respond. But those are just some of my initial comments. I'm sure the discussion will continue.
Okay. Marie's got her hand up. I think I'll bring her in quickly before I bring in Matthew.
Hello, thank you. I would like to come back to this question of Stalin and Hitler. I think everybody has said something which is right, but at the same time, it needs looking in the process of movement, not just one as opposed to the other, but as one was intervening, interfering with the development of the other. For example, right after 1917, very soon Lenin died. And so there was that focus was placed on socialism in one country, which in the end meant a non-adoption of a policy aimed at supporting the revolution in Hungary or in Poland or in Germany. There was no, when Lenin was gone, there was nothing helping, directing itself from the Soviet Union towards the other revolutions. And so in part, that did not help them. And it helped, back in turn, it helped the isolation, increase the isolation of the Soviet Union. And from that isolation, Stalin developed a policy of conciliation, of pacific coexistence. And so that gave a lot of encouragement to the capitalist system, which then could see that it could go further than it would have done if capitalism had found in Germany Russia prepared to help, for example. I don't mean particularly Germany, but I mean Hungary perhaps afterwards. There were Soviets in Hungary, and that was not supported, and it's been, the knowledge of that has been lost. Another aspect which I think is important to look at is the effect then of what has been said by Matthew, the agreements, the accords, which confused the communist parties a lot, because the French and the Spanish and the I think it's German, no, the French, particularly Communist Party, continued the policy of socialism in one country inside of France, and that was giving strength to forces which were beginning to conciliate and wanting not capitalism, not fascism, but certainly not communism. And this has an effect at every level. It seems to me that what the comrades said, what Matthew said about the failure, the destruction of the Bolshevik leadership, he placed it as one of the biggest crimes ever. And it's probably true that I see it that way. It beheaded, it took away the head of those who knew the pathway from capitalism onwards to outside of capitalism. It removed these people, and it gave a lot of encouragement to capitalism, which was, as he said, terrified by this. How come such a thing as 1917 could happen? And they kept their, am I speaking too long, Tina?
No, carry on.
Okay, and the ruling class is terrified by 1917 even now, and it has kept this terror of the working class. And now I would like to put it in a different context. Today we are. I agree that there is no mass movements that fascists could get hold of. What there is the Black Lives Matters and the people who go in the streets accusing the police of having killed a woman and denouncing the racist bills which are going through Parliament. There's a tremendous intervention on the part of people who are not communists, and they are perhaps not even in the Labour Party, but they are definitely in favor of human progress, and they represent a majority, it seems to me, in the demonstrations and the movements. And so it seems to me that today capitalism, as it globalizes, is using the nation state, the backwardness of me, I'm English, and me, I'm French, and it uses this to frighten people that you have you must identify yourself, discover your identity through your state and your flag. And so this is creating a new kind of division in the working class, like Buy British and British Jobs for British Workers, which is not a sign of the working class abandoning its historic role, but the lack of leadership, which has an international conception. And we are suffering from the fact that the World Communist Movement destroyed its ability to be an international leadership which could be serving us now. So there are still very good communist parties, but as a leadership, they have given up, they have gone. And so this creates a vacuum, which for the moment, everything is in process, for the moment is leading to the impression that the working class is not particularly preparing to give a leadership to social transformation. But I think social transformation is going to create its leadership. If you look at what's happening in the Labour Party, we never had so many leaders. A few years ago, everybody was in the Labour Party and there was no leadership. There was no ideas, there was no debate. The resolutions passed in the party were largely ignored, the conferences were ignored. Whereas now that there is in fact a crisis, it is there that we see the forces coming and the leaders coming, prepared to discuss, to analyze, and to prepare leaderships. And so I think we are in a very hopeful situation in the sense that there is information, the people who are retaking, like us, retaking the lessons of the past, the lessons of 1917, and bringing them back in this new context, which is going to take some time to find its own feet. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Marie. Matthew, please.
Thanks, comrades. Yeah, I think there's a lot of stuff in here. So it's a good debate. I would stand by my statement that without Stalin, there would be no Hitler. I think, you know, it's quite clear. I mean, the thing is, you're looking at, in Germany, the largest workers' movement, you know, the most important, probably the most important workers' movement in the world at the time, and it's Stalin that you know, disorientates that, splits it, allows that the fascists to order. Actually, you know, allies himself. The KPD actually allied itself with the fascists. You know, the Red Band referendum and so on against the SPD. You know, I mean, it wasn't just a mess; it was criminal. You know, I think that this is absolutely critical. I think the other thing, of course, is that, of course, the problem for the capitalists, of course, is they can use fascism. They obviously, at the moment, this becomes a key question, because clearly they are maintaining that as an option, because they understand obviously things are going to get worse in many facets, and therefore that these forces are being prepared, readied, and so on if they're required. But of course, it's deeply unstable. All fascist regimes are pretty unstable, and of course they don't. You know, they really can't manage. I mean, it requires them to give up a degree of control, and any, you know, once these regimes actually collapse, which they all do in the end, you know, they lose even more control, and the questions are opened up. And it's actually, if you look at Spain, I mean, clearly it is actually, again, it's actually the actions of Carrillo and the PCE is critical with the dissolution of the Franco regime to ensure a transition. You know, because it's Carrillo who signs the deals and makes sure that these work. There's not a revolutionary uprising in Spain in the late 70s, which there could have been. You know, so again, this is critical. I think the other thing I disagree with Comrade when she says, oh, you know, the contrast between there's some kind of great contrast between the fascist regimes and the Stalinist regimes. I mean, any contrast, seriously, if you look at how these things operate, and particularly, you know, the fact that because the bureaucracy actually is in a weak position, you know, in social terms, and the fact that Stalinism is not a means of production, and the fact that the whole system actually operates on this sort of, you know, ridiculous methods, and produces waste in great volume. It relies on using a bureaucratic repression and the atomization of the working class as a central point, and the use of vicious police methods, actually worse than the Gestapo. You know, the KGB's first department are undoubtedly much more professional in their repression of the working class than the Gestapo could ever match. I mean, if you look at you know, the history of, say, the guy, there was a guy, Gomulka, who became actually the first secretary of the Polish Communist Party later on, was ruler of Poland. When the Stalin and the Molotov Pact was carried out, he was in prison in Lvov. He broke out of prison at that point. He understood very well, as he was a member of the KPP, the Polish Communist Party, that the first thing that the Russians would do, they knew exactly who he was, and they put him up against the wall. So he hopped it to German-controlled Poland, because they knew the Gestapo would never find him. He survived the war and became leader of Poland. You know, even if you look at, I mean, people actually, Hungary, I mean, people actually adversely contrasted the Hungarian secret police, you know, as worse than the Gestapo in '56, which is why they were lynched. I mean, they found secret policemen in '56. They were hung from lampposts all over Budapest, you know, because obviously they're hated for extremely good reasons. And I think that you know, as a regime, it's horrible. And you can see, I mean, the other thing, of course, is you can see the instability. You know, actually, the series of working class explosions, when that control fails, you know, 53 in Berlin, you know, an explosion which is led actually by old members of the KPD, 56 in Poland, 56 in Hungary, which is actually in solidarity with Poland, and so on, and all the way through. That every time this control fails, there's an uprising of the working class. The working class begins to form itself into, its natural form, which is of Soviet-type committees and all this kind of stuff. And it's you can see why they're so terrified and why they institute this vicious repressive regime to stop this from happening and maintain their control. I think that in those terms also, and I don't agree with Tony in terms of saying that there wasn't a crisis after World War II. There clearly was. I mean, we may not be saying, okay, that they can revive the economy, but first of all, they had to get control. And that was in question. That was certainly in question in much of Europe, that Stalinism actually was the only thing that actually allowed them to get control again. And quite clearly, I mean, if you'd had if you don't have Stalinism, then there would have been revolutions in France and Italy and elsewhere in Europe. No question in the Second World War. I don't think there's any question of that at all. So I think that Trotsky's prediction in that sense is correct. However, I think that the other thing, of course, is that in terms of what people are saying is in terms of the methods of the capitalist class. And I think that also, of course, the capitalist class itself, it actually, of course, understands that it's basically on notice. I mean, they're not stupid. And so what it's doing, of course, is directly intervening all the time to try and prop up its own rule and its own methods of control and so forth, which, of course, actually damages the methods of its own system. It actually has actually damaged seriously the operation of the law of value and so on and so forth. All these things that they're done in order to try and maintain their own power. Actually fundamentally damages their own system. And I think there was a very good analogy that actually the Russian Revolution, it's like this sort of cataclysm which destroys much of the foundations of the building of capitalism, and suddenly they jerry-build something on the back of this in order to try and hold the thing together. And this is what we're living in now. This thing that's actually in bits and with bits dropping off it. You can quite clearly see it. And I think the other thing, of course, is in terms of the working class, what we see now, and particularly in the imperialist countries, especially in Britain, which of course is the oldest of the imperialist countries, is to say, right, the ruling class actually cannot, is so terrified of the working class, it understands that it has difficulty in controlling it. And so what it will do is actually remove much of production because it doesn't, it lacks the ability to control the working class in production and move itself into finance capital. And this is the impact of Thatcher. This is what Thatcher is actually the takeover by the finance capitalists, both in terms of, the organization of finances, and on a world scale. I mean, obviously, City of London operates on a world scale. It's not really even a British institution. But at the same time, the fact that, you dissolve production, and get rid of the mass, these large groups of workers in an effort to atomize the working class, and that's also what we're living with. The fact that the capitalists have done this, and that you can see it also in the States. I mean, the fact that you go to so many cities in the States now, and they resemble bomb sites, because production has been deliberately removed, and the working class has been left in many cases destitute. Deliberately so, and that's the method of control that they've chosen. And okay, you can say, right, okay, well, you're looking at a situation in which the largest concentration of workers within production now is in China. So I mean, it's a world system, and it's how does the working class itself and the left actually break out beyond the nation state and operate on that basis? I mean, the thing is, obviously, the key ruling class, which is the US ruling class, does that. Obviously, does operate itself on a world scale and does run the world in that way. And the thing is, it's now done consciously by known people in known events. So it's not sort of subject to the vagaries and crises of the system, but again, you can, if you look at, say, for example, the impact of the 2008 crisis, I mean, which clearly was, an equivalent to the Wall Street crash in many ways, is they actually then, even Bush and so on, dig out their favourite expert, Ben Bernanke, who's actually spent his time studying these things and how he intends to get out of this, and they implement a plan to keep the system from actually, going down into the abyss. The system is still hanging over the abyss. It probably will go into it, but they've actually, what they're doing is hanging on to it and trying to keep it up there by all sorts of means and methods, increasingly, ramshackle and the rest of it. But it's a conscious effort to try and maintain control in that way. Obviously, it has effects, which certainly operate in different ways. Mostly not to the advantage of the ruling class. So yeah, I think it'd be good to have more debate. Yeah, thanks, guys.
Thank you, Matthew. Steve Freeman, please.
I think I've muted myself. I just want to make a short point, because I think really what we're discussing is the fact that the world revolution between 1916 and 1921, a series of Republican and Democratic uprisings in Europe and indeed across the world, those revolutions were defeated, all of them. And so Stalinism was a product of the defeat of that revolution, and Hitler was a product of the defeat of that revolution, essentially, somewhere down. So in a certain sense, it's the counter-revolution from the revolution that began in Ireland in 1916 and then went on to Russia and then on to Germany and Hungary and so on and so forth. It's the defeat of that revolution by 1921, or at the very latest 1923. That's the root of the cause. So, did Stalin create Hitler? It's an interesting point, but I don't think it gets to the root of the problem. So, in a way, in the 20th century, there's a struggle going on between democratic republicanism and fascism, and you can see where those and where the working class stood in that. So, if you take Ireland, if you take Russia in 1917, if you take Germany in 1918, if you take Spain in 1931, if you take China in 1949, if you take India in 1947, Italy 1945, all of these points come to becoming republics, and a lot of them were defeated by counter-revolutionary forces, including Franco, including Stalin, including Hitler, including what happened in India, by the way, in 1947, where that revolution was also destroyed. So I think that struggle between fascism is because although capitalism is a global system, which everybody has agreed here that it is, works across the world, it still takes place unevenly in different nations and different states, and revolutions appear unevenly in weak links in the system, in the political system. And during the First World War, there were certain weak links in the system of politics, as there are today. So if you wanted to transfer that idea today in Europe, we'd have to look and see where the weak links in the political states were in Europe, in China, and where it was in America. We'd have to look globally to see those areas, like Afghanistan, like Belarus. But I'd certainly put Britain or the United Kingdom as one of the weak links in this situation. And they're because all of the things that have been happening with Brexit, Corbyn, and all these other factors that we've seen since the great crash of 2008. So I think we have to look at that. And it goes back to Kevin's point. I'll end here. If it's a struggle between, if we were to say, as I've just said, there's a struggle between fascism and republicanism taking place in this country, I can tell you republicanism is not going to win. We don't have a Republican movement. We don't have a Republican Party. So if I was to put those on a seesaw, I reckon in this country, fascism is much more likely to win in the situation that we've got. It's not there yet. We don't have fascism in that sense yet. But Brexit, the rise of English nationalism, and all these factors in present are all a sign of a state which is failing and breaking. We have a serious crisis of democracy, which the world had in 1916 to 1921, and we've got another version of it today. So I think there are lessons from the past of how that struggle takes place, and it's the role of the working class in the struggle for democracy that is still absolutely key. And today you could say, well, the struggle for democracy in the Labour Party is also part of that. It's not that it's gone out there somewhere, it's also within the movement, not just outside the movement as well. So I think you've got to look at that struggle in the 20th century in that way. And so it was the defeat of those revolutions from the defeat of those revolutions 1916 to 21 that gave us both Stalinism and gave us fascism, and eventually gave us Francoism as well, and those other factors. Okay, comrades.
Thank you, Steve. I agree with you on that last point. For sure that that's how the link between Hitler and Stalin, I think that makes sense. Not so sure about the, fascism is winning. I mean, we've got, 500,000 people in the Labour Party and millions voting for a Corbyn Labour Party. Things change quite quickly. I think it's not either or.
I might just say dangers. We're going to look out for the dangers and the balance of circumstances. That's all I'd say. I'm not predicting it. I'm not predicting it.
Don't be so pessimistic, Steve.
I'm not. I'm quite optimistic, actually, as it happened. But anyway.
Good. Okay, Tony's next.
Yeah, I'm probably less optimistic. I'm probably a permanent pessimist in many ways. But I think you need pessimism because it involves realism as well. As
Tony,
regards,
can you in the camera? We can only see.
Oh, sorry. You can only see Kier.
Yep.
My dear friend, I've got him on a tight rope. Fascism. I mean, Kevin's correct. Fascism is a counter-revolutionary movement aimed at destroying the working class organizations, in effect atomizing the working class. And you saw that very clearly in Nazi Germany with the Labour Front, with the Gestapo literally situated in every factory, preventing or trying to prevent dissent. That didn't mean there weren't strikes there. And people, I mean, there's a lot of history which is yet to be written about that particular period. But we're not facing fascism now. We certainly have the rise of the far right across Europe in a very uneven way. Matteo Salvini has got his problems now in Italy, for example. The failure of the French National Front in the local election. So it isn't simply a rise and a rise. But in any case, Marine Le Pen, if you take as an example, her movement hasn't arisen as a consequence of the strength of the French working class in order to smash it to smithereens. It's a racial and it's a racist and chauvinist and anti-immigrant and anti-Arab movement primarily. Indeed, I mean, the strongholds of the Communist Party in many cases around Paris and elsewhere have fallen to the NF. I mean, the Communist Party's all but disappeared in France. And that's a phenomenon we should look at. So, I mean, the rise of the far right, although extremely worrying across Europe, is not the same as the rise of a classically fascist movement. I don't think we should fall in the pit into the trap of thinking it is so. What Agnes said is also interesting when she said, well, if I'd lived in Hitler's Germany, I would have been dead, but I wasn't dead in Hungary. I mean, Stalinism, the social systems that Stalinism brought about, whether it was inside Russia itself or in the satellite countries, which were conquered, there was no social revolutions as such in them, although there were often very near approximations to that after the war, for example. They were very different societies. I mean, they were post-capitalist. I mean, the Soviet Union was not, I mean, unless you're the SWP and you believe it was simply state capitalist, I think most people would accept that capitalism was reintroduced into the Soviet Union with Gorbachev and the fall of the Stalinist regime. I mean, I gave us an example. I mean, it's only an example of students I taught from East Germany who look back with quite fondness at the social systems and support the welfare systems and so on that had existed in East Germany. That would not have been the case with Nazi Germany. So I don't think we should, if you like, elide Stalinism and fascism together. They are very different systems. But on the other hand, fascism, Stalinism rather, was the gravedigger of the revolution. There is absolutely no doubt about that. I mean, the area where I have the most expertise is the Middle East. And there is absolutely no doubt that the decision of the Soviet Union, Gromyko, the foreign minister, to recognize the state of Israel, which is a complete about turn of the Soviet Union. It had never previously supported the existence, the emergence of the Zionist state, broke the back of the Arab communist parties in the Middle East. And they were strong, especially in Iraq and Egypt. They were strong communist parties, and they completely and utterly undermined them. And that was what Stalin did in Europe to a great extent. He undermined, for example, the Greek Communist Party. As regards Matthew's analysis, that Thatcherism simply destroyed industries in order to move over to finance capital, I think that's slightly too mechanistic or conspiratorial in a way. Certainly there was a Ridley report, and certainly I'm prepared to accept that the decision was taken in effect to wipe out the mining industry because of the militancy of the working class, of the miners in that particular area. But I also think it was part of a greater project of globalization which was occurring, whereby we saw the transfer of production from the first world, if you like, to the third world. And in particular in the United States, the working class has not been particularly militant. And yet we saw, as you say, a whole wastelands where factories had been in places like Detroit, the Midwest, and so on. And the reason was you had an export of capital to the third world where labor was cheaper. We know that. So, I mean, call centers which are located in the Philippines or India or wherever, because labor is cheaper. I mean, Dyson is an example who's exported, despite being a great British patriot, as it were, is transferred his factories to Malaya and wherever else, because again, labour is cheaper, and in many ways that was part of the reason, I think, for Brexit. A section of the capitalist class, like Dyson, was in favour of breaking free of the regulations and the control of the European Union, because they thought it was more profitable to actually seek places to invest abroad without the constrictions that the European Union applied. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. Okay, we've got no more people with their hands up, so I suggest I bring in the main speakers again. First, Kevin, because he was first to speak.
Okay, comrades, thanks for the contributions, some interesting ones. And as ever, whenever we talk about history, we always end up in the present day, which is actually as it should be, because I wanted to, in a sense, show the roots of our world. Although I think there's still quite a lot to talk about in terms of the present day. But I want to go back to this idea of capitalist crisis, because in the socialist movement, really in the 19th century, I mean, it's there in the first formulations in the Communist Manifesto, but elsewhere, is the nature of capitalism as a system of crisis, but also in the idea that capitalism contains within it certain dynamics that lead to both internal crises, but also to the creation of the working class as the gravedigger. And of course, when I began my talk, I talked about the way that in 1914, the working class movement was very strong, and the great shock that many socialists, Marxists had when it turned not only into just a passive movement, but actually an active agent in that imperialist war. And I went on to talk about the role of the labor movement, both in terms of the social democracy, then later of Stalinism, as acting as quite a conscious counter-revolutionary grouping. So those points I want to return to, and in particular to talk about the tendencies in capitalism, which were, I think, apparent before the First World War, and in many ways were disrupted in the 20s and 30s, but in a sense have continued. And those, I'm thinking of the global system, globalization as we now call it, all of the points that comrades have made about outsourcing and about transferring of production, about exploitation of colonies, of semi-colonies, all of those points I think are very important. But the point about crisis, I think, isn't that we arrive at some sort of final crisis, Socialists spent a lot of time discussing this point, and in particular whether we were in this idea of the system sort of winding down. A comrade in the chat talked about capitalism as self-perpetuating. In one sense it is, but it's also self-reproducing of crisis. But the key point, of course, is how the working class movement responds to that crisis. And comrades have come up with a number of difficulties, a number of historical problems about leadership, above all about the contradiction of the period that we've discussed, and that contradiction is still there, in that the material basis for socialism, both the growth of the working class globally, and of course that's really accelerated in the last 40 or 50 years in countries like India, South Africa, Nigeria, and of course China, the growth of the world working class, but on the other hand, then the reduction and the dismemberment of a militant working class movement, and above all, a movement that is conscious of taking power. So we are in a way both in a period of transition, which links us back to that period, but we're also in a very different period, a period that's both accelerated the tendencies we saw before 1939, but it's also consolidated some of the other less positive tendencies. And that's the contradiction that we I think have to look at. The point about the politics of this, and I think about the interwar period, that it shows the variety of options that the capitalists have. But those options rely to a certain extent on the nature of their economy, and in a sense, the nature of the ability of the system to adapt and make concessions. So the American ruling class, I think, was in a position to make concessions. America was moving into the position of being the dominant world capitalist power. And in comparison with Britain, which was an empire in decline even before 1939, its ability to make concessions to its working class was limited. So, and even more so with the German capitalists, who were in an even more dire position, given the way that they had been weakened after the First World War, and of course with the contradiction they had of a very militant and well-organized working class. So what this leads us to is not a set of recipes, is not to say that if factor A is present and B are present and C are present, we get D. But it is to talk about the various options that would be open to a ruling class. I think the experience of fascism in the interwar years has made the ruling class very wary of it. And what we've seen emerge, and Tony referred, and indeed other comrades in the chat have also referred to this, are a series of authoritarian right-wing movements. And you know, the various movements in Italy, in Poland, and in Hungary are examples of that. But I don't think that they constitute fascism. But we have, I think, to look at how the state will respond in a growing period of crisis, and we can look at the situation in Europe, but also the possibilities of those forms in parts of Asia as well. Modi's regime in India shows the way that chauvinism can be mobilized and can be used. I've stuck to the historical not only because it was the basis of the talks, but also because I think, in a sense, we're still seeing the outworkings of that period. Matthew was correct to talk about the revolutionary potential in the years after the Second World War. And that revolutionary potential was halted, one, by the conscious strategy of Stalinist parties and the counter-revolutionary role that they played. But also it was supported by the dominance of the United States economy. And you know, Marxists, Trotskyists, and others did not, I think, appreciate when they were looking at the period before the Second World War of the ability of capitalism to respond in that way. In other words, the reserves that still existed. It's very clear now that I think that those reserves are being exhausted, and that means that the objective tendencies that I referred to, the concentrations of wealth, the nature of finance, capital, the other developments we've seen in terms of capitalist industry, all of these things do point towards an acceleration of those processes. But if we've learned, I suppose, one important thing, and that is that in these periods, there isn't, one, an inevitable form of crisis, and secondly, it relies upon the subjective factor of the workers' movement. It relies upon, I mean, I hate to say it, it relies upon people like us. Let's hope they're better comrades than we are, but it relies upon the subjective action of the workers' movement, of people, of arguing, of campaigning and building the forces of revolution. If we want to perhaps doubt that, let's just think of the important role of those individuals that we've looked at. Now, look at the role of Lenin in particular, Trotsky. You know, as both of them said, Trotsky in particular, if there hadn't been a Lenin in 1917, there wouldn't have been a Russian Revolution. And likewise, in Germany, think of the role of heroic individuals like Luxemburg and Liebknecht. Look what happened to them, and look at their decisive importance. The German ruling class and their collaborators, the Social Democrats, realized that importance. And in all the revolutionary movements, it was the ruling class who saw where their enemies are and dealt with them. So I think that the conditions of socialist transformation that were becoming right before 1914, and the movements that we've discussed, which show that rightness, and above all show that the ruling class are aware of that rightness, they're aware of that possibility. Because what 1917 does, and it remains, it's a very disputed legacy, but it's still a legacy for us. And above all, it's a legacy for the capitalist class, that there is not only one way of organizing society, it remains still an inspiration. And like the other struggles that go back into history, the ones that we've looked at in previous sessions, the Paris Commune, the utopian socialists, the revolutionaries of 1848, going all the way back to the people in the Middle Ages. These are people who have an idea that there is another way of organizing society. We know that capitalism has produced the means for us to transform that society. The resources, the world is ours to win. It now relies upon the creation of a party and of a movement that has that as its goal, not just to manage the system, not just to deflect the system, but to really transform it. And that, I think, is the lesson of our period. I hope that in future sessions, maybe in the next series, or perhaps into next year, that we will look at the post-war world. You know, there are plenty of inspiring struggles there, but we can learn lots of lessons, and I think many of those lessons have come out in our discussions this evening, and they're lessons that we must take into our work as active socialists in the British labour movement, and indeed the global labour movement, because that's the way we need to look at this. Anyway, thank you, comrades. Those are my comments.
Thank you, Kevin. Tony just put something in the chat, which is quite interesting. He disagrees with you that without Lenin, there would have been no Russian Revolution, which makes it too dependable on one person. But I don't know if you want to say anything about that now, or if you want to leave it for now.
I'll see him outside later.
Uh-oh. Okay, I'm bringing.
You're bigger than me, Kevin. I'll decline.
Okay, Matthew, please.
Yeah, no, I disagree with Tony on that question. I think it's, clearly Lenin is a product of the Russian situation, but it is Lenin that organizes the party. It is Lenin that brings all these. I mean, it's obviously not him individually. I mean, it's a collective, but the collective relies upon Lenin, and you can see it. I mean, everybody, anybody who actually writes about the situation, actually who's there, understands the critical role that Lenin played. I don't think there's any question that he played the critical role, in terms of bringing about that revolution. Mainly, of course, because he actually organised the party that did the job. For whatever its faults and whatever questions you can ask in terms of its politics and organisation, the rest of it, but it did the job, and it was. He was the person who led that party, because of who he was, and it was understood by everybody that he was the leader. So I mean, that's what he's owed by history. So you couldn't do without the other. The rest of the Bolsheviks and the other revolutionaries who played a part, no question. But Lenin was leader, and that's just what it was. I think the other thing, there's a number of things that I wanted to bring up, and I did like a lot of what Kevin said. I think that the thing that really it should be understood really from what happens from Russian Revolution, and subsequently, actually, something that's maintained is the balance of forces changes, and you can see that the terror of the ruling class that finally, I mean, not okay. I think there is, if you look back to the Paris Commune, you can see the impact of the Paris Commune on the capitalist class, not just in France but in the rest of the world. That here is a small taste of what you're up against, the force of the working class, for a few weeks in one city, and that's clearly sort of prefigures the situation, and that terrifies them to a great degree. And you can see that things like the whole business of trying to build this sort of imperialist chauvinism and scramble for Africa and all that sort of stuff. All that comes out of the fact that the impact of Paris, in one city for a few weeks. That's how much it means. And then you get the Russian Revolution, of course, in which it's not just a few weeks. It's actually the ruling class, the capitalists and their the autocracy is tossed out, and suddenly this is it. This is the working class in its full glory, if you like. I mean, okay, again, under conditions in which it is not a majority of the Russian society by no means, under conditions in which it's severely disadvantaged, under conditions in which the place has been wrecked by the First World War, but still, they concede all over. They concede wages, or because something you can see. I mean, sort of even here. I mean, it demonstrates to me actually looking at here they have a sailing ship which is built in Glasgow. It sits on the Clyde there, and they actually said, well, look, this actually stopped operating after the First World War because the wages of sailors went up. No connection to Russia, but clearly that was it. It was clearly why the wages they were having to pay the working class went up. At the same time, they concede the vote. I mean, most people, of course, large numbers of people didn't. The vote was still, large sections of the working class did not have the vote until the Russian Revolution, and these things are conceded. This is conceded. Not on the question of the working class having spent since the days of the Chartists and before struggling to get bits and pieces of the vote. Suddenly this is conceded, the whole damn thing at once, and you get a position in which in this city in Glasgow 80% of people vote in the 20s because they see this, it's a new thing, and they think it's going to make a difference. Now, of course, they understand very well that all the people they're offered are a bunch of scoundrels and scumbags, and less than 1 in 2 people in the city vote because we're not, people are not idiots. So it's that degree, of impact is important, and in terms of how that changes the whole nature of the thing, and of course the impact on the ruling class, You know, and I think that this is, I mean, I think this is central, because the ruling class, you're not under conditions in which the ruling class is merely accepting, you know, the movements that happen, you know, crises that happen, you know, and just allowing it to flow through. What's happening now, of course, is that there's a conscious effort, because the ruling class understands its position is in danger, that all the time there's this effort to consciously intervene in society, in production, in the functions of capitalism, in order to preserve their own position, you know, by one way or another. And that's what they're doing. You can see it, you know, all the time. You know, so really it's fear. It's fear, and it actually impacts the functioning of the system. But the point is that the actual functioning of capitalism itself, as capitalism, the law of value, the extraction of value, etc., all this sort of stuff, and the forms and functions of the system are breaking down. You know, and this is you know, you understand this. This is why Trotsky speaks of transition. Is it's not merely, you know, the fact that there's you know a conscious effort and the whole conscious thing. It's actually the system itself is breaking down. And he says this actually in the transitional program. He points out, you know, that of course the system itself is fairly much in a rotten state. And now, of course, it's actually, you know, as you can, if you walk around any city, I mean, clearly just gangrenous. I mean, gangrenous, and the capitalist class is nakedly parasitic. I mean, you can't make excuses, especially not now. I mean, the conditions, you know, you have, you know, mass poverty, and they basically they're creating money so they can give it to each other. You know, which is, I mean, it's bizarre. You know, on the face of it, and the question is, okay, as you say, what then is the response? I think that it's then, you know, the clear instability of the system, as we see through the, you know, particularly through the 20s and 30s, you know, which is also, of course, a function of the fact that there is the breaking down of the hegemony of the British, and then obviously the rise of the US. Clearly, comrades point to the fact that, you know, by the time you get to 1945, and subsequently, the US actually dominates, you know, the world economy in a way which has never been seen before or since. And in fact, I think somebody I think saw that something, I think 45% of all manufacture in the late 40s in the world was going on in the US. It's that kind of level of dominance. Now, of course, you know, what we're seeing is that itself breaking down in terms of, you know, in many ways. So you're actually ushering in another period of serious instability. And the question will be, okay, consciously, you know, is there a conscious way out? You know, is there a force can be built that, you know, again, working classes ask the question over and over. This is Rosa Luxemburg's thing about, you know, here is Rhodes, dance here. Here is Rhodes, you know, because the capitalists constantly ask the question, they constantly confront the working class, and the question is, what is the workers' response? And not just, you know, a revulsion at being attacked, but actually consciously to pose an alternative. I think the other thing that we're looking at also in over the long piece that we should also understand is that when social democracy and the Second International actually agreed to the First World War and enthusiastically, well, I mean, you know, more or less enthusiastically support the slaughter, although it's split. In many ways, it's split. I mean, you can see there's a split in the Labour Party, there's a split in the SPD, there's a split in the, you know, but the majority support the war and you know, the slaughter. That, of course, is a vast blow to that politics and to that quite large groups of workers who agreed or were members of, followed this and all this sort of thing. And actually, it's actually Stalinism which preserves in many ways social democracy and carries it on it actually sits on the back of, if you like, on the back of the existing stance. I mean, you can see. I mean, I suppose if I say locally in this city in Glasgow, that's nakedly the case, because actually, of course, the social democracy actually in Glasgow was never a particularly large organisation. Actually, the largest organisation left for many years in the city was the Communist Party. And the one sat on the back of the other. Actually, and you can see the fact that if you go into the Labour Party in this city anytime now, it's actually the main political impact. If you like, the main political impulse and dominating force actually comes from Stalinism, both on the left and the right of the Labour Party, actually. But and it's actually the dissolution of Stalinism. It's the dissolution of Stalinism in 1992, which itself actually opens the gates actually again and says, okay, well then things are clearing out again. So the possibility of building an organisation, a serious organisation, the revolutionary organisation, the working class. At the same time, it dooms social democracy, and we can see this, and we can see this now in Europe. I mean, the SPD going down the tube, the Italians, actually the PSI effectively was destroyed by Craxi in the late 80s. The PS in France, which of course was in many ways was not actually a serious socialist party, was actually a personalist invention of Mitterrand, again, has gone down the tube, and you could, and so on. You can see this, and this is what's happening to Labour Party, because the Labour Party, my view, actually, is that the Labour Party itself, that the Corbyn movement isn't actually social democracy. It's actually people looking for a means of fighting austerity, which isn't social democracy, and it's actually the two things, sit together because actually the reason that you get the Corbyn surge, of course, is that the actual left, the real left, can't produce anything credible that people will latch onto. So people latch onto Corbyn, So now that's been blown apart. But obviously the thing was dissolved. Again, the question is again posed. Okay, well, how do we produce a serious, conscious socialist movement which actually poses this whole question of the alternative to power, and of course the whole question of the climate. Again, quite clearly that none of the political forces we're offered now have any interest in actually solving the climate crisis, and that extends to the likes of the not only the Labour Party, the SNP, the Tories, whatever else, the Democrats. None of these. All of these people are wedded to the existing system, and all of them are corrupt and bought by the usual interests, and therefore, really, it's then to the left again has to seize that question as well. So yeah, I look forward to further debate in future, comrades. Thank you.
Thank you very much, comrades. That was I think a very good summing up and conclusion of our latest series. Thank you very much, comrades. Have a good evening. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.